Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started. Our setup tonight has the podium at a greater than usual distance from the front row. But hello out there. For those of you who don't know, I'm Craig Snyder, the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. I want to remind you, if you haven't already done so, to turn off your electronic devices. At a recent council program, I was the one who didn't do that, and it wasn't good. The council has a full schedule of interesting and timely events coming up the remainder of this winter and spring. There are really too many to list here, but I do want to mention the program that we will be holding next week. On Friday, March 4th, Jeffrey Garten, Dean Emeritus at the Yale School of Management, will be doing a breakfast program for us on his new book, From Silk to Silicon, talking about the history, the long history of what we now call globalization. That program is sponsored by St. Joe's Hobbs School of Business. Looking ahead, with a number of events in between that I'm skipping over for your perusal on our website, looking ahead, we'll be hosting a conversation with General Petraeus on April 29th. That program will sell out, so please make your reservations early if you'd like to attend. For complete information on all of our programs, please visit our website, www.wacphila.org. Friday, this coming Friday, is the deadline for anyone who might be interested in joining our April tour to Iran. I traveled with a group of council members to Iran in 2014, and participants returned citing the warmth of the Iranian people, citing learning a great deal about the depth of Persian history, and likewise, sort of the other side of the coin, being eyewitness to the difficulties of life under the Khomeiniist regime. Many memorable experiences, and if anyone would like to have that experience for themselves, Friday's the deadline. This will be a small group with an acclaimed leader, so please call our travel department. Our speaker events and the council's trips, such as the one I just mentioned, along with your support as members and partners, directly enable the council to conduct what we consider to be our most important work, that of educating a diverse group of over 2,200 middle and high school students in more than 90 schools throughout the Philadelphia area, fostering the skills and sensibilities that they will need in order to thrive and compete in a knowledge-based global economy. We have some of our students here with us this evening. They usually ask some of the best questions in the room. Now on to tonight's program, which is the first installment, as you know, in our spring series titled The West in the Muslim World and the Muslim World in the West. This series is made possible by the Stan and Arlene Ginsberg Family Foundation Great Debates grant. Just a few short months ago, we all remember vividly, on December 2nd, 2015, 14 people were killed and 22 injured in a terrorist attack in San Bernardino, California. It was the worst attack of this kind on U.S. soil since September 11, 2001. One of the perpetrators of the attack was a natural-born U.S. citizen, having been born in Chicago and raised in California. Though described as quiet and polite by his coworkers, FBI investigators said that Farouk had become increasingly radicalized in the years leading up to the attack, partly through consuming what the FBI called poison on the internet. Since 9/11, 2001, more than 300 Americans born and raised in Minnesota, Alabama, New Jersey, and elsewhere have been indicted and were convicted of terrorism charges. Some have taken the fight abroad. An American was among those who planned the attacks in Mumbai, for example, and more than 80 U.S. citizens have sought to join ISIS. Others, like Farouk, have acted here on American soil. What motivates these Americans? How are they trained? And what do we sacrifice in our efforts to track them? With us tonight to discuss these questions and more is Peter Bergen, CNN national security analyst, journal, and of course author. Mr. Bergen has authored 5 books, including the one we'll discuss tonight, The United States Jihad. Mr. Bergen has written about Al-Qaeda, Afghanistan, Pakistan, counterterrorism, homeland security, for a wide range of publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, the Wall Street Journal, and many, many more. He has worked as a correspondent or producer on several documentaries, including in 1997 when he produced Osama bin Laden's first television interview, in which Osama bin Laden declared his war against the United States for the first time to a Western audience. Just before coming in here and turning off my phone, I checked it, and there was a news item that said ISIS fighters seize a police facility in Libya and behead 12 policemen. This is a problem we're going to see, it seems, every day. It's the most important topic, perhaps, of our time, and we have one of the most qualified people here tonight to engage us with it. So please join me in welcoming Peter Bergen.
Inviting me. So I'm going to talk about some of the themes of my book, and then we're going to have a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to everybody here. So let me start with a story, since we're in Philadelphia. One of the people I profile in the book is called David Coleman Headley. And David Coleman Headley is the son of a Philadelphia mainline socialite who, at the age of 17, married a Pakistani TV news anchor that she met in Washington. And they moved to Pakistan, they lived there for 10 years. The marriage soured, and she came back here and she opened the Khyber Pass Bar, which I believe still operates in Washington, in Philadelphia. And David Coleman Headley, her son, was a bartender at the bar, and eventually got sort of sucked into the drug scene and became a fairly major drug dealer in Philadelphia. And was starting to do some very big drug deals, 2 kilograms of heroin. He got arrested at Frankfurt Airport and went to prison. Then he resumed his career as a drug dealer, got arrested again, and it was around this time that he became slightly more devout. His father obviously was a Muslim, his mother was a Christian, but he kind of turned to Islam in an effort to kind of straighten his life out. And David Coleman Headley is, I think, a fairly pure example of a sociopath, which is actually quite unusual. Most terrorists that I profile in the book are very ordinary Americans. But David Coleman Headley was a drug dealer who then became an informant for the DEA. He was a supposedly devout Muslim who had multiple girlfriends and wives and was cheating on them. He was an American citizen born in Washington, D.C., who eventually, in Mumbai, scoped out an American target, which was the Shabbat House in Mumbai, which is basically a center for Jewish life in Mumbai. And he was absolutely instrumental to the Mumbai attacks. You may recall they happened in 1998. 166 people were killed. They took place over 3 days. They targeted the Taj Hotel, they targeted the Oberoi Hotel, they targeted the main railway station, and they targeted the Shabbat House, which is an American Jewish center in Mumbai, and they killed 6 Americans. And David Coleman Headley was, because David Coleman Headley had an American passport, lived in Chicago, looked like a Westerner. Interestingly, he had one blue eye and one brown eye, kind of a testament to his mixed heritage. But he had become, over time, he'd become intrigued by a Pakistani terrorist group, Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a pretty large terrorist group in Pakistan. He got recruited by them, and they asked him to go to Mumbai to basically take all the surveillance photos of the targets that the 10 gunmen would attack in late November 1998. And he was the perfect spy. He was almost a James Bond of jihad. He would go to, even though he befriended a lot of Indian Bollywood film stars. He went to Mumbai 7 times to scope out all the targets. He found the place on the Mumbai waterfront where a boat of Lashkar-e-Taiba gunmen come into land, and could do so undetected and then get to their targets. And so, it's kind of surprising that many years after 9/11, an American citizen would be somebody who was instrumental in this very deadly attack. But Colin Headley, he's one of more than 300 cases of Americans who have been indicted or convicted of some kind of jihadi terrorist crime since 9/11. Myself and my research team to build a database of cases so that we can, for the book, so we could make some general claims about who these people are. And many of the crimes are not serious crimes, sending small amounts of money to a terrorist organization. But some of them are serious, like the Mumbai attacks or the Boston Marathon attacks or San Bernardino or other attacks. And I guess the first question the database can answer is, who are these people? And it turns out they're Americans. We tend to think of terrorism as being a foreign import, because on 9/11, 19 Arab-born hijackers attacked us. Well, and I'll get to this in a little bit, our defenses are now very good, and we've made it very hard for a foreign terrorist organization to attack us. Well, what that means is that when we are attacked, we're going to be attacked by Americans. And so Major Nadal Islam, an American born in Virginia, an Army major in the American military, the San Bernardino husband that you mentioned, born in Chicago. Every lethal attack, interestingly, in the United States since 9/11 has been carried out by an American citizen or an American legal permanent resident. So this is an American phenomenon. All this discussion about refugees and the potential kind of threat they face is basically is not substantiated by the facts. Of the 300 plus cases we looked at, 4 out of 5 are American citizens or American legal permanent residents. So the first big thought is, this is an American phenomenon. The second big question then is, why are these people doing this? And there is no easy answer to that, because if I ask every one of you to kind of explain how you got to where you are today, all of us have a narrative about how we got somewhere. But a lot of life is happenstance, and and also the kind of larger social, political context, historical context in which you live. And so when I look into the cases that I looked into in the book, I can give you a sort of answer to why the Boston Marathon bombers killed an 8-year-old boy and a 23-year-old Chinese graduate student and a 29-year-old female restaurant manager in Boston. I can sort of give you an answer. It was some combination of objections to American foreign policy, disappointments in life. Their parents had recently divorced. To the two brothers who carried out the attack, their parents had recently divorced. Both the parents had moved back to a part of Russia the family had originated from. The older brother, Tamerlan, had dreams of being an Olympic-level boxer, and basically those dreams disappeared. And he was unemployed at the time of the attacks, and in his own mind he was a heroic figure, and he was living, getting welfare benefits. He was unemployed, relying to a large degree on his wife's income as a homemade worker. And then the younger brother, Jahar, was failing college, smoking a lot of marijuana, and was sort of flailing around. Now, there are 50% of American marriages end in divorce. Lots of people have disappointments in life. Lots of people have things that go wrong with their family. Lots of people don't do well in college. Lots of people have dreams that don't materialize. Lots of people object to American foreign policy. Very few people then go out and murder completely innocent people. And so the why can be pretty complicated. And when I looked into, my wife is from Louisiana, and I'm going to use a Louisiana metaphor here. When you look into the why, it's sort of like a gumbo, which has different ingredients. It has a lot of the same ingredients, but they take up kind of, each gumbo is different, how long you cook the roux, what ingredients you put into it. And so, yes, this has something to do with Islam. I mean, that to pretend otherwise is delusional. The settler movement in Palestine is, of course, based on certain Jewish beliefs about the sacredness of Judea and Samaria. That's a fundamentally religious movement. The Crusades had quite a lot to do with Christian beliefs about the sanctity of Jerusalem. So Islamist terrorism has something to do with Islam. Of course, it's a cherry-picked version of Islam. But if you look at the Quran, which is not a book, if you're a believer, it is the word of God. There are certain verses that if you cherry-pick, you can come up with a pretty violent kind of worldview. And so Islamist ideology, which I call Bin Ladenism in the book, has a theory about history, and it has a theory about who's getting in the way. The theory of history is that all ideologies have one thing in common. They claim to explain the world, whether they're religious or secular. They claim to explain the future, because in all ideologies that I can think of, there is a utopian future to which history is moving towards. So in Nazism, it was the 1,000-year Reich. In communism, it was a stateless, it was the classless society. For Bin Ladenism, it is a Taliban-style utopia that runs from Indonesia to Morocco. Ideologies also have this in common. History will be perfect. We will get to this utopia, but there are people getting in the way. And because they're getting in the way of utopia, they deserve to die. And so for the Nazis, it was the Jews and the Gypsies and the homosexuals that had to die, and the Slavic peoples in many cases. For the Stalinists, it was counter-revolutionaries and kulaks. They had to die. For Bin Laden, it is the Jews, the United States, Americans, Arab regimes that don't live according to Taliban-style precepts. Those are the people that need to be disposed of. And so this ideology is clearly what ISIS is kind of as a more pronounced version of. But this is the ideology that many of the people in the book sign on to. Now, when I say that, a lot of these people are not Islamic scholars by any stretch. I mean, Jihad Sanian, I think I know more about Islam than he does, and I don't think, and I'm not claiming to have a huge amount of knowledge. The younger brother in the Boston Marathon bombing. Major Nidal Hassan, he was a very observant Muslim. He was at the mosque at 4:30 every morning. He gave a third of his income away to Islamic charities. He was extremely devout. And on the face of it, and this is getting into the why question in more detail, and I used a quote from the philosopher Immanuel Kant from The Crooked Timber of Humanity, Not a Straight Thing is Made, because I think that is very useful if you're a journalist or a historian or trying to explain humans, because humans, by their nature, are very hard to explain and very individual. And so the more you know about something and a person, the more complex it becomes. And our minds want to create people to fit into categories because it's easier to think about the world when we have categories, but of course people define neat categorization. So Major Nidal Hassan, on the face of it, is an Islamist, very devout. But I talked to Nader Hassan, his first cousin, who was a double first cousin. So he genetically, two brothers married two sisters. And Nader is a successful lawyer in Northern Virginia, a secular Muslim who keeps beers in the fridge and who feels that the secular Muslim voice is not really, no one's speaking for him. Because if you think about the Muslim organizations in this country, they're often Islamic in nature. Nader says that his double first cousin, Nidal, actually went postal and dressed it up in the garb of Islam. He was unmarried. He was unmarried at age 39. He probably never had a physical relationship with anybody else. He had no friends really to speak of. He was a very indifferent army psychiatrist who should have been actually just thrown out of the army on that basis alone. And he was very afraid of deploying to Afghanistan. And so for his cousin, yes, there was this, he is a devout Muslim on the face of it, but when you get into the actual why he did it, it becomes a lot more complicated. And so, having spent 2.5 years on the book, I can say that the stories I look at the end of the day, when there's a certain point where on the why that you can't explain further, and maybe that gets to the nature of evil itself, which is inexplicable. Ultimately, I can give you a very good answer on one level about why Hitler did the Holocaust, but you get to a point that it's essentially inexplicable and pointless. You can say, yes, he was an anti-Semite and he kind of grew up in a certain milieu in 1920s Vienna, and there's all sorts of things you can say about it, but you can't really explain it in any deep, meaningful way beyond just the sort of the history of the event itself. And I'm not comparing any of this to the Holocaust. I'm just saying that the why is often very, very hard. And at the end of the day, perhaps this is something that a novelist would have done better than non non-fiction writer, but I'm a non-fiction writer, not a novelist, and I'm dealing with facts, and I'm trying to present a factual case in all these cases. So in the time I have left, I want to make two other observations. I've kind of told you the who to some degree, which is ordinary Americans. Their average age is 29. A third of them are married, a third of them have kids. Same average income as most Americans, same average education. They're ordinary Americans. I told you a little bit about why. And so that naturally leads to the question is, how has the government dealt with this? Has the government been effective, and what level of threat does this pose? And I would say the government has done a very good job of managing and containing this problem. There are two statements that I'm going to say that I don't think any politician running for office is going to say, but they're both true, even though they appear slightly contradictory. The first is we manage and contain the problem. And the second is that it's a persistent low-level threat, and by the law of averages, we're going to get one through. I mean, these are both, they're not inconsistent, but that is the facts. If we'd had this conversation in 2002, and I told you, or I predicted that in the next decade and a half, 45 Americans would be killed by jihadi terrorists in the United States, that would have seemed absurdly optimistic. I mean, the United States was concerned about another wave of the 9/11 style attack. And so, you know, on average, 3 Americans have been killed every year by jihadi terrorists in the United States. That is an extraordinarily low number. And of course, each of these deaths is a tragedy, but this is not a national catastrophe on the scale of 9/11, or even on the scale of Paris, where 130 people were killed in November. The reason that we have managed to contain the threat, and I'll just give you a few examples. On 9/11, there were 16 people on the no-fly list, now there are 47,000. There are 1.5 million people on the tied list, which is a much larger list of people who are deemed to have some connection to terrorism, and if they try to get on an American plane, will be put into secondary screening. On 9/11, the FBI and the CIA did not talk to each other. In fact, the CIA knew that 2 members of Al-Qaeda were living in San Diego. They knew that for almost a year, and they didn't tell the FBI until August the 25th. Now the FBI and the CIA talk to each other quite a lot. On 9/11, there was a failure to connect the dots that we knew that were in the system. Now we have something called the National Counterterrorism Center, which is analysts across the government trying to connect the dots. On 9/11, the FBI was essentially a law enforcement organization solving crimes, and now it's a domestic intelligence agency of quite some size. There are thousands of FBI analysts. There are an army of FBI informants. Some I get into that in the book. Some of what they've done has been overkill. One of the people I profile in the book is a paranoid, who's a schizophrenic bipolar kid who was sort of brought into a plot by the FBI to blow up a bank. And you know, if he hadn't had the bad luck to encounter an FBI informant, he'd be in a group home getting medicine, and he's got the mind of an 8-year-old as far as I can tell. So there's been a huge amount of effort by the government. Some of it is sort of shaded into overkill. Of course, the NSA phone metadata program, 5 years of all your phone data the government kept, produced almost absolutely nothing. It didn't stop any terrorism. It was a complete waste of time, really. Was, of course, the Fourth Amendment is the Fourth Amendment. It was an unreasonable seizure, in a sense, without a warrant. Now that's changed. So we have, on 9/11, you know, the intelligence budget was 28 billion, now it's 80 billion. On 9/11, there was no public knowledge that this was a problem. The people who disabled the underwear bomber on Northwest Flight 253 over Detroit on Christmas Day 2009 were the passengers. They saw somebody with crotch pouring out of smoke pouring out of his crotch on a plane, and they were like, you know, there was something wrong with this picture, and they disabled him. So, but the point is that public knowledge is a huge false multiplier to everything I've said that the government has done. So this has made us a very hard target. Our defensive capabilities are very high, and then our offensive capabilities are very high. We have killed Al-Qaeda's central group that attacked us on 9/11. You mentioned ISIS, you know, doing something in Libya. Of course, ISIS is, you know, this kind of new iteration of this. But the fact is that very few Americans have gone to Syria for training by ISIS, and none have returned that we know of publicly. A lot of them go there. It's very dangerous. They get killed. So we're protected by geography. You can drive from Paris to Damascus. You can't drive from Damascus to Philadelphia. We're also protected by the volume of people who've gone. I mean, 1,500 French citizens have gone. We're talking about a few dozen at most Americans who've gone to Syria successfully and been trained. some of them not necessarily by ISIS. And so basically what we face going forward is a persistent low-level threat. We'll see a San Bernardino occasionally. This couple had no criminal record. They were 27 and 28. They both were graduates from college with technical degrees. He was earning $70,000 a year, a very solid middle-class family, living the American dream, it looked like, and yet they carried out this terrible massacre. So unfortunately, we will see more of that, but we will not see a Paris-style attack where everybody trained in Syria was financed and directed and trained by ISIS itself. We're just not seeing that in this country, and we're unlikely to see it. So, to leave on a sort of optimistic note, lone wolves who aren't attached to a foreign terrorist organization, that is the threat of the future. And there's good news in that lone wolves by definition can't do very much. 9/11 we were attacked by 19 hijackers. They had hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank. They were supported by dozens of other people. They had training camps in Afghanistan. They had money transfers from Dubai. They had command and control group in Hamburg, Germany. All that, you just can't put that together again because the United States would interrupt almost everything I've just described. And so we will have this lone wolf threat. They will get one through occasionally, but it is an issue that is to be managed and contained. And history will surprise us, and something else will come along that we can't. We manage this one. I mean, there'll be something else that will be surprising because that's what history does.
Thank you. So, as you know, the series that you're helping us launch here is called The Muslim World in the West, and the West in the Muslim World. I want to kind of talk about each half of that real quickly with you before we turn to questions from our audience. When you list the measures that have been taken that have been effective since 9/11 in protecting the United States from this threat, you've focused in these remarks on law enforcement, intelligence, and to a certain extent military capabilities. But I found fascinating in your book, in addition to all of that, your discussion of the difference between the integration of Muslim Americans versus Muslims in Europe and elsewhere. And I wanted to ask you to kind of speak to that. Obviously there is a great controversy in our politics when people look at the threat. As you said, there are many different factors, but the commonality is membership in the religion of Islam. So if you could speak a little bit about what you see as the sort of place of Muslims in the United States and how that has affected not the threat, but the counter threat.
Muslim Americans are as educated as the average American. They have the same average incomes. 10% have graduate schools. 10% of the average Americans go to graduate school. So they're well integrated into American society. Interestingly, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Defense of Religion Act in Virginia in 1786 or something, it was, I can't remember the exact date. Anyway, he specifically mentions Muslims in this Defense of Religion Act, which became the basis of, one of the bases of the First Amendment. So Muslims have been in this country for a long time. They've done pretty well here. And everything I just said is not true in Europe, where Muslims are not living. There is an American dream. It's worked pretty well for Muslims. That is not the case in Europe, where 10% of the French population is Muslim, 70% of their prison population is Muslim, which is an astonishing statistic. I think says a lot about, if you look at the Charlie Hebdo attack, they met in jail, these guys. If you look at the Paris attacks, many of the attackers did spend time in prison. And so we're looking at I grew up in the UK, and I think the UK has done a better job than perhaps France. But these are countries that are fundamentally not based on immigration. And if you look at the rise of nationalist or proto-fascist parties in the UK and in France and many European countries, and this is going to get much worse, by the way, because the wave of immigration from Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq is it's absolutely phenomenal, and there's no end in sight. And even supposedly liberal countries, or very liberal countries like Sweden, sending people back, and there's going to be a huge anti-immigrant backlash, and that's going to provoke further alienation by these disadvantaged populations who may turn to violence as an answer. So I think the problem in Europe, it's going to get worse, and you could imagine a Paris-style attack happening, not infrequently. You've had the Director of National Intelligence said last week that there have been 6,900 Westerners have gone to Syria. Of that 6,900, there may be, 1 or 2% of them are from the United States. 1%. The rest are from France and Germany and UK, and 750 Germans, 750 Brits, 1,500 Frenchmen. Every European country has had fairly significant numbers go. And, some of them are returning. And so you can see that we have been insulated to the American dream has been a firewall to a large degree against having more of this phenomenon. What's interesting to me, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, is it is still puzzling why a decade and a half after 9/11 any American would be signing up for this ideology, since at its heart it's profoundly anti-American. And there are a number of reasons. I told you that obviously it's a very individual choice, but for some of the people I profile, it's because it's fun. David Coleman Headley, who I mentioned at the beginning, his motivation was, I think, sociopaths enjoy getting one over on people, and his motivation seemed to be largely that he was, this is a terrible pun, having a blast. But David Coleman Headley, so other people I profile in the book is Samir Khan from Charlotte, North Carolina, who was the first editor of Inspire magazine, which was the first English language jihadi magazine. And the internet was essentially founded by Americans, so it's interesting that Americans were instrumental in founding the English language jihad materials on the internet, Inspire magazine, many others. But Samir Khan was, before he joined Al Qaeda in Yemen, he was working as a kind of computer support specialist in a call center in suburban Charlotte, North Carolina. It was a pretty boring life. Suddenly he's going to Yemen, and he's meeting members of Al Qaeda, and by his own account, it was enthralling. So, but getting back to the question, we've done a pretty good job here in the United States of welcoming Muslim Americans. There are very few the only kind of almost ghettoized American Muslim population is in Minneapolis, which is the Somali Americans. They live in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood in Minneapolis, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country, where average incomes in 1999, which is the last time that there was data for this, were like $15,000 a year. And, but that's the exception. For every other Muslim group that's come here, they don't live in ghettos. They tended to do pretty well.
Do you worry that what you call proto-fascism, nativism, is on the rise in the United States?
Well, I wrote a piece which I asked. There's the most important historian of fascism is called a guy called Robert Paxson, who I believe was at Columbia. And I looked at his book, which is called The Anatomy of Fascism, and he has a checklist of what it takes to be a fascist based on looking at many fascist movements. And I asked the question, is Donald Trump a fascist based on this checklist? And the answer is a qualified yes. Here's the qualification. The one thing Donald Trump is not, suspicion of outsiders, charismatic leader, appeal to the emotions. I mean, there's a whole, there's a whole checklist. The one thing that he's not doing is he's not calling for violence, and he's not even, even subtly suggesting that. So I would say that he's a proto-fascist. or, I mean, which may be a very loaded term, but he's certainly an extreme American nationalist of some kind. We've seen this before in the United States. You know, Richard Hofstadter, who wrote the famous Harper's Magazine article, Paranoid Style in American Politics. I mean, Americans have been very paranoid about all sorts of groups of people throughout their history. At one point it was the Freemasons who were part of a conspiracy to destroy our way of life. Then it was the Catholics who were part of a conspiracy to destroy our way of life. Often it's been the Jews. It was the communists who had secretly taken over the state farm. I mean, this has been a pretty, this is a very American phenomenon, to be paranoid in a completely irrational manner about certain groups of people. And Muslims are, you know, the flavor du jour of the moment right now. But for the reasons I outlined earlier, it doesn't make any sense.
All right, let's turn around the other way and look at the West in the Muslim world. So one of the sort of best, or at least most often used summaries of the Bush Doctrine was, we have to fight them there in order to avoid fighting them here. Many argue that our fighting them there, so to speak, has led to radicalization in many places, including here.
Yeah.
So I wonder sort of which side you come down on. That, while the Bush Doctrine literally was not carried forward by President Obama, as we were talking about in the reception, President Obama has engaged in armed conflict in 7 Muslim countries.
Yeah.
So do you see our foreign policy being, as many argue, an instigation of the United States of jihad?
I mean, it depends on which conflict we're talking about. It is a fact that Al-Qaeda in Iraq didn't exist before we invaded Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, of course, is the parent organization of ISIS, so you can draw, you know, Saddam Hussein didn't like opposition of any kind. He particularly didn't like Islamists. So, you know, he's a secular dictator. So he, you know, he was very brutal about making sure these groups didn't exist. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who founded Al-Qaeda in Iraq, we're going to have Jeremy Warwick come speak. He has a very good new book about it. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was founded in Iraq officially in 2004, a year and a half after we invaded. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq is now ISIS. So, yes, I mean, this was counterproductive on quite a lot of levels. That said, you know, I think it depends on which intervention we're talking about. I have spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, and I was there under the Taliban. And so I can tell you as a witness that life under the Taliban was pretty grim. Women didn't have jobs or education. The population of Kabul, the capital city, was probably 500,000. Today it's 3.5. People don't even know what the number is, 4 million. You know, they basically took the country back to the Middle Ages, and they destroyed whatever remained of its economy. So my smart Afghan friends on 9/11 were happy, not about the attack, but they were happy because they knew that the United States wouldn't let it stand, and the Taliban would be gone. And so our intervention, I think, in Afghanistan was a very good thing. We got rid of the Taliban. Afghanistan has still got lots of problems, but I can tell you, last year in Afghanistan, 3,000 civilians were killed in the war. Last year in Iraq, 3,000 civilians would be killed every month. And this population of the same size. So we're talking about the violence is on an order of, is much larger in Iraq. And then Syria is even more dangerous. So the war in Afghanistan is continuing, but at a pretty low level. I hope that whether it's Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or whoever is president, will reverse President Obama's decision, which I think is a very bad one, to pull out of Afghanistan at the end of 2016. Because look, ISIS is already appearing in Afghanistan. And Afghans, by and large, want us to stay. My Afghan friends say, we can be Somalia or South Korea. And you know, we want to be the latter. South Korea was one of the poorest countries on the planet at the end of the Korean War, and now it's one of the richest. And it's become that because it has existed with an American security umbrella. And when I say I'll stay in Afghanistan, for some period of time. I don't mean having a big combat presence. I mean having Afghans don't care if it's 500 troops or 9,800. They just want us to stay because they see it as a guarantor of their national stability. So I think I would say that it depends on the intervention as much as, because in the Afghan war, the US Congress voted to do the Afghan war. The UN Security Council, the UN voted and said that US military action essentially was permissible. Article 5 was invoked for the first time in NATO history, which is the right for a nation that's been attacked to collective self-defense. This had a lot of legitimacy as a war. So I think part of the question comes down to the legitimacy of the war. The Iraq war was seen by a lot of people as not being legitimate. The actual premise of the war turned out to be wrong. And it's had this very counterproductive effect of re-energizing Al-Qaeda, which is then permutated into ISIS.
So your description of the Afghanistan war as essentially successful.
Yeah, I mean, with very expensive, still going on, but I mean, but Al-Qaeda. I mean, well, the main goal was to make sure Al-Qaeda never had a base there again. That has happened. And also to prevent the Taliban from returning to power.
So that account differs from the narrative. Again, we were talking about this before, the formal part of the program. Differs from the narrative that says that this sort of belt buckle of the world that goes from North Africa all the way to Indonesia is embroiled in increasing chaos. And when the United States intervenes, as we did in Iraq, we end up with chaos, anarchy, terrorism. And when we don't intervene, as in Syria, we end up with chaos, anarchy, and terrorism. And so a lot of people, I think, looking at this, looking at the upcoming presidential election, don't know what policy to prefer because they see sort of all the alternatives as failing.
Well, I think you just described fairly well where President Obama has been for many years, in a sense. I mean, because one of his questions, I think, about this intervention in Syria was, okay, what does day 2 look like? We know what day 2 looked like. The day 2 after Gaddafi turned out to be kind of a big failure. The day 2 after Saddam Hussein fell turned out to be a big failure. And so the only thing worse than a dictator is anarchy, which is something that Hobbes pointed out a long time ago after the English Civil War in the Leviathan. And so what we have, I mean, I thought the death of bin Laden, and frankly, I'm surprised that we're still having these conversations. I thought the death of bin Laden and the Arab Spring would be the end of this, because Al-Qaeda was basically done. The death of bin Laden put a big sort of finals. Terrorism was going to continue, but this group that attacked us on 9/11 was out of business. And the Arab Spring, Al-Qaeda was not involved, their people weren't involved, their ideas weren't involved. And yet, what we have now is a series of vacuums in various places, and ISIS or groups like it, are going to step into this vacuum. In fact, there's almost a political science kind of law that we can say, which is the weaker the state is in the Muslim world, the stronger the presence of ISIS will be, or if not ISIS group like it. So a totally failed state like Syria, ISIS has a big presence. A very, pretty much failed state like Iraq, ISIS has a big presence. Yemen, a totally failed state, ISIS and other groups like Al-Qaeda in Yemen, which is still doing pretty well, has a big presence. Libya, a totally failed state, ISIS has a big presence. In countries with a functioning government like Indonesia, sort of democratic, these groups are relatively insignificant. So unfortunately, I don't think that really answers your question. It's a description of another problem, which is okay, yeah.
It does, and our audience got to hear Thomas Hobbes cited at a World The political science major in me loves that. Okay, we're going to open to questions from the audience. We have microphones on either side. If you would come to the microphone so that everybody can hear you.
We also have Manning Cat.
Yes.
I'll do others.
Thank you for a really wonderful talk and a very good explanation. You started by telling us that your team had compiled a database and that you worked from this database, and that the database tells us that roughly 3 Americans are killed domestically each year since 9/11 by jihadi terrorists. Well, we also know that we kill about 30,000 Americans with gun violence each year, and that we have killed far more in individual events, in a theater in Aurora, in a school in Connecticut, in a theater in Louisiana.
Yeah.
Was your team, were you able to discern any discriminator between the seemingly random gun violence that is endemic in the United States and the 0.1% lethal violence that you identify as jihadi?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, that's a big question, and the numbers, you know, in any given year, Americans kill each other with guns. The rate is 10,000 murders with guns every year. I'm leaving aside suicides and everything. So you're in any given year, you're more than 3,000 times more likely to be killed by a fellow citizen with a gun than by a jihadi terrorist in the United States. And that says a lot about the violence that exists here. You know, in 2010, there were 41 gun murder deaths in the UK. There were 10,000 in the United States. So the real price, in the summary at the end, you know, when I get to the conclusion, I make some of these points about gun violence, and I also, you know, climate change. You know, there are some very big issues that we either just, we become inured to the problem, I think, with gun violence, and climate change is by its nature is hard to implement, although it doesn't. You know, climate change doesn't behead people. So, you know, ISIS is a story. I begin the story with 3 American kids from Chicago who decided to join ISIS right after Jim Foley was killed, or around that time. That was the most, Jim Foley's execution was the most widely followed news story in the United States for 5 years, according to Cold Case. 95% of Americans have heard about it. And so, the reason, you know, fear is not rational. It tends not to be rational. And so, I mean, I agree with your basic point. If you do the thought experiment where every one of these, you know, mass shootings involves somebody shouting Allah Akbar, you know, they would be much bigger news stories. Now we don't even, it's almost, they don't register unless they're killing kids or unless there's a really large number of victims. There's a mass casualty shooting every day in the United States. Mass casualty is defined as four deaths or woundings. And that's, so I agree. I mean, you're absolutely right. But the Americans are concerned about this in a way that they're not concerned about other things, even though they should be.
Come over here. Good evening. I'm interested in the use of terminology to describe the phenomena, and I thought I heard you infer that President Obama might be delusional. So I was hoping you could elaborate.
No, I don't think he's delusional at all. Obviously not. What I'm saying is, the president has made a decision not to talk about Islam in the context of this phenomenon, and I think he's making the right decision for the following reason, which is, if people think that we're at war with Islam, the more the president of the United States says Islam, 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 doesn't matter what he says, you know, the more it appears that we are at war with Islam. So I think he's making a sound decision not to talk about Islam too much in this context. Now, he's a smart guy. He surely knows this has something to do with this certain kinds of Islamist militant beliefs. But he's choosing not to say that, and I think he's making the right decision, even if the facts, you know, he's allowed to do whatever he wants. I mean, we can't force him to say the word Islam every time there's a terrorist attack. He has made the decision not to say it, and I think it's the right decision. Because, and even though this has something to do with Islam, as some of the stories I just mentioned, David Coleman Headley's a sociopath who was having fun. Major Nadal Hassan was somebody with a lot of personal disappointments. You know, it's always a little bit more complicated than just Islamist militant beliefs. But that is part of the gumbo.
Please.
Yeah, one observation and one question, if I may.
Yeah.
On 9/11, looking back, it seems to me that the most important fact of that attack was that the protocol for a hijack was to do nothing.
Yeah.
that went out the window with the fourth airplane because there was more information. So it seems to me that that attack was a perfect storm of bungling on the government and a mindset that allowed it to occur. The question is that Mr. Trump has, of course, trumped us all in that we believed that he was a joke, we believed that he couldn't go on, that would all blow apart, and he has managed now to make talking heads and almost everybody who's talked about it like a fool. He is somewhat of a proto-fascist, he's also a narcissist. I think that we have to
He thinks
start-
very highly of you.
Oh, no. And he's a wonderful guy. He's bringing people out. He's bringing people out to the polls like that before. But I think we may have to start believing that he believes what he's saying,
Yeah.
instead of the assumption that this is all just being done for an election. That being the case, again, he's a proto-fascist, but he's an enabler. Do you think that if he were to win, that he could really create tremendous havoc in this situation?
Yeah, I have no idea. I don't think, I think it's hard to predict, and I think, Max Boot, who's no friend of the Obama administration, or Democrats in general, has a very good piece today in commentary about, it's a pretty, it's a real broadside against Trump on the basis of, apparently BuzzFeed found some interview that he gave around the time the Iran war began about basically Trump is having kind of recovered memories about his views on the Iran war. It turns out he only began really opposing it around the time of Abu Ghraib and when the war was being lost. So he said a lot of different things, and I think so it's hard to it's hard to discern what his actual policies would be. I think one indicator would be he's going to announce something fairly soon who his foreign policy and national security advisors are. And I think that would tell you, the biographies of those people would tell you a lot more, I think, about what a Trump administration would look like than what he said. And I think there'll be quite a lot of continuity. There always is, right? I mean, there was much more continuity between Obama and Bush than people thought there would be in terms of counterterrorism, these sorts of issues. There's a permanent establishment of people in the business who are, it doesn't matter if they're Republican or Democrats, they kind of share a lot of the same views that the CIA, the National Counterterrorism Center, So that's a long way of saying my guess is there will be continuity, but I don't know. Please.
Thank you very much for coming here tonight. I had a question about social media, because to me it seems like a double-edged sword with regards to the problem of terrorism in the United States. It seems like on the one hand, it can be a tool by which counterterrorism agencies can track the spread of ideas and see who's espousing radical Islamist ideas. But at the same time, it seems like it makes it easier for those ideas to be disseminated. So do you have any ideas about how social media can be used to counter terrorism, or how, basically what the role of social media should be in, I guess, the fight against terrorism?
The railways made the Civil War a lot more, the American Civil War was more deadly because of the railways. It was the first time you had a lot of people in the battlefields. And obviously the railways are a good thing on a lot of levels. And they're also, so I mean, that's a way of just saying technology tends to be double-edged sword often. And social media is the case in point, because as you indicate, the FBI, I think, has developed a lot of cases because people, for some reason, they post on Facebook or Twitter, I don't think that the FBI is going to, the FBI is perfectly legally entitled to look at people's public Facebook or Twitter postings. And so that has been a boon, and I quote an FBI official in the book saying it's been very helpful. On the other hand, social media is inspiring people in basements and bedrooms in Texas and Minnesota, and to get these ideas. And you used to have to go to a radical mosque or an overseas training camp to get the ideology. Now you can get it in your home. And the whole idea of a lone wolf is kind of qualified here because, and I quote a Israeli counterterrorism expert, Dario Wyman, who had a very good formulation. He said the lone wolf is part of a virtual pack, because when you get online, you're meeting hundreds and thousands of people around the world who all appear to share your exact beliefs. And you're in an ISIS echo chamber, and your people are, there was a wonderful story in the New York Times about a woman in Washington State, 23. ISIS people were online with her for thousands of hours, and they were sending her gifts, books and chocolates, and she was ready to go and join ISIS. And so social media, is part of why this ISIS phenomenon is doing so well. What can we do about it? Twitter just took down 125,000 pro-ISIS accounts. And these companies all have terms of use. The terms of use is you cannot post content that incites acts of violence. And so these companies just have to enforce their own terms of use. And they're beginning to do that. They are doing that. The problem is ISIS is now using social media platform Telegram, which is based in Berlin. And doesn't matter what, if Congress suddenly passed acts demanding that all this content be taken down, it doesn't affect a company based in Berlin. So again, technology sort of outpacing kind of where we are, the legal structures we have.
Last question. Sorry.
I actually had about 40 questions, but I'm hoping I can limit it to two. Your book, which I'm looking forward to reading, has the benefit of history. We have a border that is open, that the sheriffs are dealing with on a daily basis, and extremely concerned about what's going on down there. So we're talking about, your book, which is historical, and what the posing threat might be from those who you mentioned in the beginning want to basically get rid of us. That's question number one. And question what your thoughts are about the open border. And question number two is, as a woman, I consider Sharia a form of jihad. I do understand very much that it is a culture clash, and I have serious concerns about that culture clash, and I think that's largely what's going on in Europe. And I'd like your thoughts on that as we accept more people into this country who do very much believe Sharia should be their way of life. Thank you.
Okay, well, the last one is a complicated one, because Sharia, most Muslims think that Sharia is a good thing, but that doesn't mean that they think that Taliban-style rule is a good thing. I mean, they see it as Sharia is, interpreted in lots of different ways in different parts of the world, and there is no evidence in the United States of any. Dearborn, Michigan has more Muslims proportionally than any other place in the United States. So, if it was a serious concern that a lot of Muslims wanted to live under Sharia law, that would be a place that you would look for it. And there is nobody in Dearborn is asking for Sharia law. A number of legislators, state legislators, have passed legislation in this country sort of outlawing the practice of Sharia law as a sort of legal standard, which is crazy because no one's asking for that, and it's one of these laws that doesn't make any sense because nobody's asking for that. So I don't think, I'm not concerned about people coming to this country wanting to live under Sharia law. Most of them are coming to this country because they want a better life, a better opportunity, just as every other generation of American immigrants have come. And I think that question is a form of the question that Jack Kennedy faced, which was his allegiance going to be more to Rome than to the United States? And of course, that turned out to be a ridiculous question. So I'm very unconcerned about the issue of Sharia law coming in some shape or form here. On your other question about the border, in the 330 cases I just outlined that I looked at, not one of them came over the U.S.-Mexico border. not one. The border that we might be more concerned about is the Canadian border. A guy called Akram Rassam, before 9/11, drove a car. Luckily, he was arrested at the border. He was planning to blow up a bomb in Los Angeles International Airport during Christmas 1999. It would have been a big deal. But he came over the Canadian border. So there's been a lot of sort of, I don't know, there's been a lot of fear that somehow jihadists would infiltrate over the US-Mexican border. There's just no evidence for that.
Okay. I'm gonna allow one more.
Thank you so much. I was really struck with your response to what I think is a very emotional desire of many Americans to have the president claim ISIS as Islamic and to use the word quite frequently. And so I guess I question what's the right balance and how we should look at when our emotion speaks to, for example, wanting Apple to unlock the phone and the opportunity that presents and the dangers that presents, as well as when we want to open our arms to welcome refugees and the opportunities that presents to fill our need for compassion, recognizing the dangers that presents. So what's the way we should be assessing these opportunities against the dangers?
Right, it's a brilliant question because, of course, we've taken 2,000 Syrian refugees. There are 14 million Syrian refugees. 4 million are outside Syria. We've taken almost nobody. I mean, I think it's almost unprecedented in American history that we've performed so poorly when there's the biggest humanitarian crisis since World War II. I mean, I don't think, I think we've done very, very badly. We're planning to maybe take 10,000 more. It's a drop in the bucket. And it's been highly politicized, and I've already indicated no refugees have been involved in lethal terrorist attacks in the United States. In my database, we found 9 cases of refugees involved in convicted or indicted with some kind of jihadi terrorism crime, usually very minor crimes. Kind of material support for a terrorist organization which can take a variety of different forms. And if the standard, by the way, is that, because members of the mafia were universally Italian, therefore we should not accept Italian Americans, we wouldn't have the governor of our state, of New York State being Italian. The country would be a very different place. We wouldn't have had Frank Sinatra, we wouldn't have had Andrew Cuomo, we wouldn't have had his father, we wouldn't have had named all famous Italian Americans. So anyway, on the refugee issue, I think we've just come to kind of irrational fears. And then on the other issue that you raised, which was the other issue? Apple. I come down on Apple's side for the following reason. I don't think there's anything very interesting on that iPhone. I'll tell you why. They did a very thorough search of the house. They did a very thorough interrogation of his accomplice, who is going to face many years in prison. They have everything that he put in the cloud. They have everything that he had on his Verizon phone account. They have a lot of material. I don't think there's going to be no big surprises. So that's one aspect. The other thing is, this is not about San Bernardino. This is about the larger kind of question about will American technology companies be allowed or be forced to have backdoors in encrypted products. And if you put a backdoor into something, it's not encrypted. It's that simple. And it's about market share. Apple is the most valuable company in the world. If consumers around the world, in China and other places, felt that the United States had basically carte blanche into these products, that Apple would not be the most valuable company in the world. Apple is just one example. There are other tech companies. The reason our economy is doing relatively well is to a large degree because of the booming tech sector. So do we really want to sabotage that?
Thank you very much. Thank all of you.